The massive diplomatic chamber of Concordia Prime held representatives from 63 different species. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that stretched 50 meters high, and the air hummed with translation devices working to convert thousands of languages into something everyone could understand. Ambassador Thelzen of the Vrin Collective sat in his elevated seat, his four eyes tracking the human delegation with barely hidden disgust. The humans sat at the lowest tier of seats. That placement wasn't an accident. For 3 decades, humanity had occupied those bottom seats, listening to complaints, absorbing insults, and making concessions. The Galactic Council had decided long ago that humans were useful but dangerous. Like a guard animal that needed to be kept on a short leash, Ambassador Chenwei sat perfectly still as the Karathi delegate. A reptilian creature named Strack delivered yet another list of demands. His voice echoed through the chamber with the confidence of someone who knew the outcome before he started talking. The human colony on Kepler 442 must be abandoned within 60 standard days. Strack hissed. The system rightfully belongs to the Korathi hegemony. Furthermore, all human military vessels must reduce their active fleet by an additional 15%. This is non-negotiable. Several delegates clicked or chirped their approval. The Zephyr representative, a floating mass of tentacles and bioluminescent organs, pulsed with colors that the translation matrix interpreted as agreement. The humans had heard this song before. Give up territory. Reduce military capacity. Accept restrictions that no other council member would tolerate. Chenwei raised her hand. The gesture was ignored for a full 3 minutes before the council speaker finally acknowledged. The Terran Union rejects these demands, she said. Simply, the chamber erupted in a cacophony of sounds, laughter, anger, disbelief. Thelzen leaned forward in his seat, his mandibles clicking in what his species considered amusement. You reject? He said, his voice amplified across the chamber. Ambassador Chen, your species seems to forget that you are here by the Council's grace. You have no allies. You have no significant military power. You exist because we allow it. More laughter. Chenwei stood slowly. The human delegation behind her, 12 people, representing billions, stood with her. Something about the movement made Thelzen's amusement fade slightly. For 31 years, for months and 17 days, Chenwei began. Her voice cutting through the noise like a blade, humanity has sat in these chambers. We have listened to demands that we reduce our defenses while you increase yours. We have watched you carve up territory that belonged to smaller species who couldn't defend themselves. We have accepted trade restrictions designed to strangle our economy. You accepted because you had no choice, Strack interrupted. We accepted because we believed in the idea of the Galactic Council. Chenwei continued. We believed that talking was better than fighting. We believed that patience would lead to understanding. We were wrong. The chamber fell silent. This wasn't the usual human response of careful negotiation and strategic retreat. 6 months ago, Chenwei said, the so-called Galactic Prosperity Sphere was formed. 6 of you decided that humanity needed to be contained. You blockaded 3 of our colony systems. You prevented supply ships from reaching settlements where children were going hungry. When we protested, you laughed. Thelzen shifted in his seat. The blockades had been his idea, a way to demonstrate human weakness without actually starting a war. A human medical ship responding to a plague outbreak in the Talveri system was fired upon by Vrin military vessels. 14 doctors and nurses died. When we demanded an explanation, we were told it was an unfortunate accident. Chenwei's voice remained level. But something in her eyes made Thelzen's 3 hearts beat faster. 3 weeks ago, this council voted to restrict human access to the hyperspace relay network, effectively isolating our colonies from each other. The vote was 58-5. Only the species we've helped, the ones we've defended, stood with us. She paused, letting her words translate fully. So let me be clear. Humanity is done. We are withdrawing from the Galactic Council, effective immediately. We will honor no council resolutions. We will accept no council authority. We will not attend any future sessions. The chamber erupted again. But this time the sounds were different. Confusion, concern, and from Struck, genuine laughter. "You cannot survive outside the council," the Karathi delegate said. "You will be carved up within months, perhaps weeks. This is suicide." "Perhaps," Chen Wei said. She gathered her papers, an old human gesture that seemed almost quaint in a room full of holographic displays. "But it will be our choice, not yours." The human delegation filed out. They walked with dignity, their backs straight, their faces calm. To Thelzen, they looked like people walking to their execution. But then he noticed something that troubled him deeply. They were smiling, not the fake diplomatic smiles that humans wore during negotiations. These were genuine expressions of something that looked almost like relief or anticipation. A junior aide rushed to Thelzen's side as the chamber doors closed behind the humans. "Ambassador, our intelligence division is reporting something strange." "What?" "Human ships. Thousands of them. They're all moving simultaneously. Every human vessel in non-human space is withdrawing. Military, commercial, civilian. All of them." It started exactly 3 minutes before Ambassador Chen stood to speak. Thelzen felt cold despite the chamber's comfortable temperature. That's not possible. Coordinating that many ships across that much space would require military precision, the aide finished. And planning. Months of planning. The council speaker was already calling for order, preparing to discuss the human withdrawal. Most delegates seemed relieved. The troublesome humans were removing themselves from the equation. But Thelzen couldn't shake a growing sense of dread. He pulled up his personal data tablet and accessed the Vern Military Intelligence Network. What he saw there made his blood turn to ice. Reports were flooding in from dozens of systems. Human ships weren't just withdrawing. They were repositioning. Civilian vessels were being escorted by military cruisers. Merchant ships that had always traveled alone were now moving in protected convoys. And strangest of all, human colonies were going dark, implementing communication blackouts. "They're preparing for war," Thelzen whispered. His aide looked confused. "But Ambassador, they just left the council. They've isolated themselves. They're weaker now, not stronger." Thelzen thought about the way Chen Wei had smiled. About the precision of the mass withdrawal. About 31 years of humans sitting quietly in the lowest seats, accepting insults, absorbing defeats, always watching, always learning. What if they were never weak? He said quietly. What if they were just patient? The aide laughed nervously. "Sir, we've beaten them in a dozen border skirmishes. Our fleet strength is 10 times theirs. Even if our intelligence reports say our fleet strength is 10 times theirs," Thelzen interrupted. "But how do we know? We know what the humans told us. We know what our sensors detected. But what if those sensors were only seeing what the humans wanted us to see?" In the Korathi section of the chamber, Strack was already planning his strike against the Kepler cluster. The humans were withdrawing. It was time to take what should have always belonged to the strong. Thelzen looked at his aide. "Send a priority message to the Vrin High Command. Tell them to delay any military action against human space. Tell them we need to reassess the situation." "On what grounds, sir?" Thelzen looked at the empty seats where the human delegation had sat for more than 3 decades. "On the grounds that we might have made a terrible mistake." Admiral Kreshtar of the Karathi Third Fleet felt the thrill of an easy victory approaching. His fleet of 200 warships hung at the edge of the Kepler cluster, a rich mining system currently occupied by barely 30,000 human colonists. The system had 3 habitable planets and asteroid fields loaded with rare metals. It should have been Karathi territory decades ago, but the Council had forced compromise after compromise. Not anymore. "All ships prepare to jump," Kreshtar ordered. His tactical display showed 12 human ships in the system. Cruiser-class vessels. Nothing that could stand against even a tenth of his fleet. The humans had sent their people to die defending dirt and rocks. The fleet jumped. Space twisted, and 200 Karathi warships appeared in the Kepler system like predators surrounding wounded prey. Kreshtar opened a communication channel to the human vessels. "Human ships, This is Admiral Kreshtar of the Karathi hegemony. This system now belongs to the Karathi people. You have 1 standard hour to evacuate your civilians and surrender your vessels. Failure to comply will result in the destruction of all human assets.
Oh.
The response came quickly. A human woman appeared on his screen, wearing a simple military uniform. She looked young, barely old enough to command a single ship, let alone a defensive force. This is Captain Sarah Mitchell of the Terran Defense Force. Admiral, we decline your terms. Kreshtar's mandibles clicked in irritation. Captain, your 12 ships face 200. Evacuation is the only rational choice. Rationality is subjective, Mitchell replied. Our answer is no. The communication ended. Kreshtar stared at his blank screen for a moment, then shook his head. Humans. So stubborn. So foolish. All ships, weapons free. Target the human vessels. Let's make this quick. Karathi fleet opened fire. Energy weapons and missile salvos filled the space between the two forces. Kreshtar expected to see human ships torn apart within seconds. Instead, something impossible happened. The human ships moved. Not the slow, predictable maneuvers of Council-era human vessels. These ships twisted through space like dancers, their acceleration curves defying what Kreshtar thought human engines could produce. Point defense systems that shouldn't have been able to track Karathi missiles swatted them from space with 98% efficiency. And then the human ships returned fire. The first Karathi destroyer simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, the next it was an expanding cloud of superheated gas. Kreshtar's tactical officer made a choking sound. Admiral, that was a kinetic round, traveling at 0.15 light speed. How is that possible? Kreshtar didn't have an answer. The human ships were moving through his fleet like sharks through a school of fish. Railguns that fired solid projectiles at relativistic speeds. Energy weapons that burned through Karathi shields as if they weren't there. Electronic warfare that made his own ships fire on each other. All ships, evasive maneuvers. Kreshtar shouted. Reform defensive position. But there was no time. The 12 human ships had become 12 death machines. They operated with a coordination that suggested a shared consciousness, each vessel anticipating what the others would do. When 3 Karathi cruisers tried to overwhelm a single human ship, 2 other human vessels appeared from impossible angles and destroyed all 3 before they could fire. The battle lasted 6 minutes and 43 seconds. When it ended, 197 Karathi ships were debrised. 3 ships, including Kreshtar's flagship, were left floating in space, their engines destroyed. Their weapons offline, Captain Mitchell's face appeared on Kreshtar's screen again. She looked tired but satisfied. Admiral, your remaining ships are being allowed to survive for one reason. You're going to take a message back to your hegemony. Tell them this is what happens when you attack human space. Tell them this is what we look like when we stop holding back. Holding back, Kreshtar whispered. This was you holding back? No, Mitchell said softly. This is us with the Council restrictions removed. For 30 years, we limited our weapons to 40% power output. We handicapped our defensive systems. We followed engagement rules designed to make us easy to beat. We did all of that because we believed in peace. You taught us that was a mistake. The screen went dark. Kreshtar slumped in his command chair, staring at the tactical display that showed the graveyard of his fleet. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out. The Vrin lost an entire border fleet of 83 ships to a human task force of 7 vessels. The battle was so one-sided that human casualties were listed as 0 killed, 5 injured. The Zephyri Confederacy's fortress world of Kalmar Ix, considered impenetrable for 2 centuries, fell in 14 hours to a human marine division that numbered less than 10,000 soldiers. On Concordia Prime, the Galactic Council chambers became a chaos of panicked voices. Thelzen stood at his podium, watching intelligence reports flood in. His worst fears were being confirmed in real time. How do we not know? The Zephyri representative pulsed, colors flashing in distress. How did our intelligence miss this? They didn't miss it, Thelzon said quietly. The humans hit it. For 3 decades, every human ship that entered non-human space operated under severe restrictions. They lost battles they could have won. They retreated when they could have advanced. They made themselves look weak. But why? Strack demanded. The Karathi delegate had gone pale after hearing about Admiral Kreshtar's defeat. Why would they handicap themselves? A small voice came from the back of the chamber. Ambassador Yellen, of the Talvari Unity, one of the minor species that had voted against the human restrictions, spoke up. Because they hoped we would learn to be better, she said softly. They hoped that if they showed patience, if they absorbed our insults and accepted our unfair terms, we would eventually treat them as equals. They believed in us more than we deserved. The chamber fell silent. Thelzon pulled up a tactical analysis that his military advisors had just completed. The numbers were horrifying. Human ships operated with technology at least 50 years ahead of what the Council believed they possessed. Their weapon systems weren't just more powerful. They were fundamentally different, based on physics principles that the Council's scientists hadn't even theorized yet. And their coordination suggested a military command structure that could make decisions and execute plans at speeds that seemed impossible. There's more, Thelzon said, his voice heavy. Our analysts have reviewed battle footage from the past 3 decades. Every time we defeated human forces, every time we pushed them back, they were learning. They studied our tactics. They analyzed our weapons. They were treating every defeat as a training exercise. That's insane, another delegate said. Who loses battles on purpose? Someone playing a longer game than we understood, Thelzon answered. He thought about Ambassador Chen Wei's smile as she left the council chambers. They came to the council hoping for peace. But they prepared for the day when peace would fail. And that day is here. Emergency communication requests flooded in from dozens of systems. The Vryn military wanted to know if they should launch a counteroffensive. The Karathi were demanding council support to reclaim their lost territory. The Zephyri were screaming about war crimes after the fall of Kalmar Ix. But Thelzon was reading something else. A message that had just been delivered to every council member's personal terminal. It was from Earth, from the Terran Union's government. The message was simple. All council species have 72 hours to withdraw military forces from disputed border regions. Failure to comply will be considered an act of continued aggression. The Terran Union does not want war, but we are no longer afraid of it. Thelzon looked around the chamber at the faces of delegates who had spent decades treating humanity as a minor inconvenience. They were afraid now. Finally afraid. We need to respond, Strack said. We need to show them we won't be intimidated. We are intimidated, Thelzon said flatly, and they know it. The question is whether we're smart enough to admit it before this gets worse. Worse. The Zephyri representative pulsed. How could it possibly get worse? Thelzon thought about the human ships that had destroyed fleets in minutes, about the precision of their withdrawal, about 30 years of careful planning and patient preparation. Everything we've seen so far, he said quietly, is probably just them making a point. Imagine what happens if they actually decide they want to win. 6 weeks after humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Council, the galaxy began to fall apart in ways nobody had predicted. The wars were going badly for the Council species, certainly, but that wasn't the real crisis. The real crisis was everything else. On the Zephyri colony world of 1037, Colony Administrator Vresh watched helplessly as the medical crisis spiraled out of control. A plague had broken out 3 weeks earlier, something the Zephyri immune system wasn't designed to handle. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a manageable problem. The colony would call for human medical teams, who staffed most of the major hospitals in this sector. Those teams would arrive within days, distribute treatments, and the plague would be contained. But the human medical teams were gone. All of them. They had withdrawn to human space the same day Ambassador Chen left the council chambers. How many dead? Vresh asked his aide. 17,000 as of this morning. The number is accelerating. Our own doctors don't understand this disease. It's not responding to any of our standard treatments. Fresh pulled up the emergency protocols on his data screen. There was a contact number for human medical assistance. He tried it, knowing what the response would be. "This is the Terran Medical Corps," a recorded voice said. "All contracts with non-Terran entities have been terminated. We are not accepting new requests for assistance at this time. If this is a genuine emergency involving loss of life, please contact the Talvar Unity, who may be able to provide basic support." The message ended. Fresh stared at his screen, feeling something close to despair. The Talvari were good people, but they were a minor species with limited medical knowledge. They couldn't help with something like this, Administrator, his aide said quietly. The human medical teams that used to work here. They left behind all their research data on local diseases. They didn't have to do that. They could have encrypted it or destroyed it. Fresh accessed the files. The humans had indeed left their research, but it was like reading a textbook written in a language he only partly understood. Human medicine operated on principles that seemed almost alien. They didn't just treat symptoms. They understood diseases at a molecular level that Zephyr science hadn't reached yet. On Vrin Prime, similar scenes were playing out across dozens of sectors. The hyperspace relay network, which enabled faster-than-light communication across the galaxy, was failing. The relays were incredibly complex machines that required constant maintenance. For 2 decades, most of that maintenance had been performed by human engineering firms. Chief Engineer Thalvin stood in the primary relay station, watching warning lights flash across his control board. 3 more relays had gone offline in the past hour. His team was trying to repair them, but it was like trying to fix a machine when you only understood half of how it worked. The humans who maintained these systems, Thalvin said to his supervisor, they made it look easy. They would diagnose problems in minutes that take us days to understand. They were just technicians, his supervisor said dismissively. We have the manuals they left behind. We can figure this out, but they couldn't. The manuals the humans had provided were technically accurate, but they assumed a level of engineering knowledge that the Vrin didn't possess. It was like giving someone a manual for a fusion reactor when they were still trying to understand. Combustion engines. Ships were getting lost now. Without the relay network providing updated navigation data, vessels were jumping blind through hyperspace. Some arrived at their destinations. Others simply disappeared. The Galactic Trade Network, which had operated smoothly for centuries, was collapsing on the Korathi homeworld. Economic Minister Skelroth watched the financial markets crash in real time. The numbers on his screens showed a cascade of failures that seemed impossible. Commodities exchanges were freezing. Currency values were swinging wildly. Entire sectors of the economy were simply shutting down. How is this happening? He demanded. His chief analyst, a young Korathi named Dresh, pulled up a series of reports. Minister, we didn't realize how integrated human traders were in our economic system. They were the ones willing to deal with minor species that the major powers ignored. They would accept currencies that we considered worthless and convert them into something useful. They lubricated the entire commercial system. They were just traders, Skelrath protested. Small-time merchants. They were everywhere, Dresh said quietly. In every market, every exchange, every trading post. They were the ones who made deals happen when nobody else would bother. And now they're gone. The same pattern repeated across the galaxy. Human maintenance workers had kept power systems running. Human logistics coordinators had managed supply chains. Human teachers had staffed schools on frontier worlds where local species wouldn't go. For 30 years, humanity had woven itself into the fabric of galactic civilization, not through force or politics, but through simple usefulness. Nobody had noticed until they were gone at the Galactic Council. Emergency sessions ran around the clock. The Vrin wanted to launch a full-scale invasion of human space to force them back to the negotiating table. The Korathi were demanding that someone do something about their collapsing economy. The Zephyri were begging for medical assistance. Thelzon stood at his podium, looking at delegates who were finally starting to understand what they had lost. We need to accept reality, he said. We went to war with humanity thinking they were weak. We were wrong. But the war isn't even the real problem anymore. The real problem is that we built our entire civilization on a foundation that included human labor, human knowledge, and human cooperation. We took them for granted. And now, we're learning what life is like without them, and we force them to come back, Strack said. We have fleets. We have weapons. Our fleets are losing, Thalzan said flatly. Every engagement ends in defeat. The humans aren't even trying to conquer our territory. They're just destroying our military assets and moving on. Do you know why? The chamber was silent. Because they don't want our territory, Thalzan continued. They don't want to rule us. They just want us to understand that they don't need us, and that we need them more than we ever. Admitted. A message arrived from the Talvari. Unity. Ambassador Yellen had been granted an audience on Earth. She was one of the few non-human delegates that the Terran Union was willing to speak with. The council held its breath, waiting for news. When Yellen returned, she looked shaken. She stood before the council, her small form dwarfed by the massive chamber, and delivered humanity's message. I spoke with the Terran Union's leadership, she said. I begged them to name terms for peace. I offered to mediate negotiations. I promised that the council would listen this time, and, Strack demanded. They said they're not interested in peace terms. They said they're interested in making a point. What point? Someone asked. Yellen's voice was quiet but clear. The point is that you don't get to treat people as inferiors for decades and then demand their help when it's convenient. The point is that humanity doesn't need the Galactic Council. But the Council, apparently, needs humanity. And they want you to understand what that feels like. Thalzan watched the chamber erupt in angry voices and panicked discussions. He pulled up casualty reports from the ongoing conflicts. Human military losses were minimal. They were fighting a war across dozens of systems with an efficiency that seemed impossible. But they weren't occupying conquered territory. They weren't demanding surrender. They were just removing threats and moving on. It was almost scarier than traditional conquest. What did you do with an enemy who didn't want anything except for you to understand your own mistakes? A priority message appeared on Thalzan's personal screen. It was from Vrin Intelligence, marked urgent. He opened it and felt his blood run cold. The humans had just published something. A complete intelligence dossier on every member of the Galactic Council. War crimes. Genocides of minor species. Slavery operations. Economic manipulations that had caused famines. Centuries of abuses, all documented with the kind of meticulous precision that only humans seemed capable of. It wasn't classified. It's information shared in secret. It was public. Available to every species in the galaxy. The humans had put it all on open networks where anyone could access it. Thalzan thought about 30 years of humans sitting quietly in council chambers. Watching and listening and recording. They hadn't just been preparing for war. They had been preparing for this moment when the masks would come off and everyone would see what the Galactic Council really was, on Vrin Prime.
All right.
Riots began within hours of the information going public. The civilian population was learning what their military had done in their name. On the Zephyr homeworld, the government fell. On Karathi worlds, civil unrest spread like fire. The humans weren't just winning a war. They were destroying the very foundations of the power structures that had oppressed them. And they were doing it without firing another shot. Thalzan looked at the chaos in the council chambers and wondered if humanity had ever really been the weaker species, or if they had just been waiting for everyone else to make a fatal mistake. 3 months into the conflict, the galactic prosperity sphere fractured in exactly the way humanity had predicted it would. The alliance that had been formed to contain human expansion was now tearing itself apart as each species tried to save themselves. Thalzan sat in a secret meeting room deep inside Vrin Prime's governmental complex. Across from him sat a human diplomat, a woman named Dr. Sarah Okonkwo. She was not a military officer. She carried no weapons. She was simply a negotiator. But her presence here represented something that would have been unthinkable. 3 months ago, the Vrin were trying to negotiate a separate peace with humanity, betraying their allies in the prosperity sphere. The terms are simple, Dr. Okonkwo said, her voice calm and professional. The Vrin Collective will withdraw all military forces from disputed territories. You will provide full reparations to the minor species you've displaced over the past century. You will submit to war crimes tribunals. And you will publicly acknowledge that your treatment of humanity was unjust. Thelzan felt his mandibles tighten. These weren't terms. This was surrender. But what choice did his people have? The Vrin military was in shambles. Their economy was collapsing. And now their own population was rising up against them after learning about atrocities committed in their name. If we accept these terms, Thelzan said carefully, humanity will cease military operations against Vrin's space? Yes, Dr. Okonkwo replied. But understand this, Ambassador. We know about your allies. We know that you're trying to negotiate separately while the Korathi and Zephyri continue fighting. We know everything. And if you try to deceive us, the consequences will be severe. Thelzan believed her. The intelligence dossier that humanity had published proved they had been watching and recording everything for decades. They knew about secret alliances, hidden weapons programs, classified operations. The humans had been listening to every conversation, reading every document, observing every decision. How long had they been doing it? How much did they know? Before Thelzan could respond, an emergency alert flashed on both their datapads. Something had happened in human space. Something terrible. The Korathi had launched a kinetic bombardment against a human agricultural world called New Harvest. 16 asteroids accelerated to high velocities and dropped from orbit. 300,000 civilians were dead. Cities were burning. The images flooding across galactic networks were horrific. Dr. Okonkwo stood slowly, her face pale. This meeting is over, Doctor, please, Thelzan said, standing as well. The Korathi acted without consulting the rest of us. This isn't 300,000 people, she said quietly. Farmers, teachers, children. The Korathi murdered them because they couldn't beat our military. Thelzan watched her leave. He knew what was coming. The galaxy held its breath, waiting for humanity's retaliation. Every species expected a devastating counterstrike. Orbital bombardment of Korathi worlds. Maybe worse. But it didn't come. Instead, humanity did something far more calculated. They published another document. This one was different. It wasn't about council corruption or hidden crimes. It was a complete record of every agreement, every treaty, every promise that had been made regarding the conduct of war. And it showed, with legal precision, that would hold up in any court, that the Korathi attack on New Harvest violated every single one of those agreements. The document also included something else. A detailed plan for what humanity called proportional response under international law. The humans weren't going to destroy Korathi worlds. They were going to blockade them. Within 48 hours, every Korathi system was surrounded by human ships. Not attacking. Just waiting. Nothing got in. Nothing got out. No trade vessels. No supply ships. No communications beyond basic diplomatic channels. Economic Minister Skelrath watched his civilization begin to starve. The Korathi homeworld imported 70% of its food. That flow had stopped. Industrial worlds that depended on raw materials from mining operations were going dark. Medical supplies weren't reaching hospitals. They're killing us without firing a shot, he told his colleagues. How is this possible? The answer was simple and terrible. The Korathi economy depended on galactic trade. They had built their entire civilization on the assumption that trade routes would always be open, that resources would always flow, that the network of commerce would always function. The humans had just proved that assumption wrong. On the third day of the blockade, riots began on the Korathi homeworld. By the fifth day, the government was negotiating surrender. By the seventh day, the Korathi hegemony had accepted every human demand, including handing over the military commanders who had ordered the attack on New Harvest, a human admiral. A man named James Chen, who happened to be Ambassador Chenwei's brother, explained the strategy in a communication that was intercepted and went viral across galactic networks. They wanted to teach us that there are consequences for defying the Council, Admiral Chen said. We're teaching them that there are consequences for war crimes. The difference is, our lesson will stick. We could have glassed their worlds. We could have killed billions, but that would make us like them. Instead, we're showing them that humans understand something they don't: the difference between power and cruelty. The message resonated across the galaxy, especially among minor species who had suffered under council rule for generations. Humanity wasn't behaving like conquerors. They were behaving like teachers, and the lesson was brutal but clear. Meanwhile, the Zephyr Confederacy was tearing itself apart from within. The intelligence data humanity had released showed that the Zephyr government had been running secret extermination programs against 3 minor species, wiping them out to claim their territory. The Zephyr civilian population, who had never known about these crimes, rose up in revolution. The Zephyr military tried to maintain control, but they were fighting 2 wars now, one against humanity, which they were losing, and one against their own people, which was tearing their civilization apart. Ambassador Yellen of the Talvari. Unity stood before what remained of the Galactic Council and delivered a speech that would be remembered for generations. For centuries, we minor species lived in fear, she said. Her voice carried across empty chambers where most delegates had stopped showing up. We watched the major powers commit atrocities and pretended not to see. We accepted our place at the bottom because we had no choice. But humanity has given us something we never had before: proof, evidence, documentation of every crime, every abuse, every lie. She gestured at the data screens showing the intelligence releases. They could have kept this information secret. They could have used it for blackmail or political leverage. Instead, they gave it to everyone. They gave it to us. And now we know that we don't have to accept this anymore. In the empty council chambers, Thelsan watched her speak. The Vrin had already signed their surrender terms. They had been the first to break ranks, trying to save themselves while their allies fell. Now he wondered if there would even be a Galactic Council left when this was over. A young Vrin intelligence officer approached Delzan with a new report. Ambassador, we've completed our analysis of human military capabilities, and everything we've seen so far represents approximately 40% of their total fleet strength. The ships that defeated our forces were older models. The humans have been building new vessels for the past decade. Our analysts believe the new ships are at least twice as capable as the ones we've already faced. Thelsan felt a chill run through him. They've been fighting us with their second-rate equipment. Yes, sir. And they've been winning easily. Thelsan thought about Admiral Chen's message. About proportional response. About the difference between power and cruelty. The humans had been holding back even after they stopped holding back. They were winning a war across the entire galaxy while barely trying. What happens if they stop being patient? He whispered. The young officer had no answer. Across the galaxy, human ships continued their methodical destruction of military targets. They didn't occupy territory. They didn't demand tribute. They just eliminated threats and moved on. And with each victory, with each blockade, with each piece of released intelligence data, the old order crumbled a little more. The Galactic Council, which had ruled for 10,000 years, was collapsing. Not because humanity wanted to destroy it, but because humanity had shown everyone what it really was: a system built on lies, maintained through fear, justified by nothing except the power of those at the top, and the people at the top were learning that power alone wasn't enough when your opponent understood something you didn't. That real strength came from being right, not just from being strong. On Earth, in the halls of the Terran Union government, leaders prepared for the next phase. The war was almost over. The council was broken, but the hard part was still ahead. It's building something better from the ruins. 7 months after Ambassador Chen Wei walked out of the Galactic Council chambers, the war ended not with a final battle, but with a message. The Terran Union transmitted a single document to every government, every species, every settlement in the galaxy. It was marked simply, Terms. Thelsan read the document in his private office on Vrin Prime. His hands trembled slightly as he scrolled through page after page of demands that were somehow both expected and shocking in their completeness. Galactic Council was dissolved, effective immediately. The institution that had governed galactic affairs for 10,000 years would cease to exist. All treaties, all agreements, all power structures built around it were void. The major powers would submit to war crimes tribunals, not human tribunals. These would be presided over by representatives of the minor species they had oppressed for centuries, with human observers ensuring fairness but not controlling the outcomes. The Vrin, the Karathi, the Zephyri, all of them would answer for their crimes. Reparations would be paid. Territories taken through genocide or forced displacement would be returned. Economic exploitation would end, and perhaps most shocking, humanity would not be taking a leadership role in whatever came next. Thelzahn read that last point 3 times, certain he was misunderstanding. But the language was clear. The Terran Union was proposing the formation of a new galactic assembly, where every sapient species would get a vote, where power would be distributed based on population and representation, not military might, where humans would participate as equals, nothing more. They don't want to rule us, Thelzahn whispered to himself. They never did. The realization was somehow more terrifying than conquest would have been. 3 weeks later, the first session of the Galactic Assembly convened in a new station built specifically for this purpose. Not Concordia Prime, with its history of oppression and its monuments to council power. This was something new, built with resources contributed by dozens of species. Including humanity, the chamber was different too. No elevated seats for major powers. No lowest tier for inferior species. Just a circular arrangement where every delegate sat at the same level, facing each other as equals. Ambassador Chen Wei stood to address the assembly. She looked older than she had 7 months ago, the weight of war visible in her face. But her voice was steady. 7 months ago, humanity withdrew from the Galactic Council because we could no longer participate in a system built on injustice. We hoped that walking away would be enough. We hoped you would understand the message. We were wrong. The chamber was silent. Thousands of delegates from hundreds of species listened, so we went to war, not because we wanted to, not because we enjoyed it, but because sometimes peace requires the threat of force, and justice requires the willingness to fight for it. We showed you what humanity looks like when we stop pretending to be weak. We showed you what we're capable of when we stop accepting your rules. Chen paused, letting her words translate fully across hundreds of languages. But showing you what we can do was never the end goal. It was just the beginning. Because the real question wasn't whether we could defeat you in battle. The real question was whether we could build something better than what came before. She gestured around the chamber. This assembly is our answer. Not a human empire. Not Terran domination. But a genuine attempt at equality and justice. We're not naive. We know this won't be perfect. We know species will disagree. We know there will be conflicts and compromises and difficult choices. But here's what makes this different from the Council. Everyone gets a voice. Everyone gets a vote. And everyone will be held accountable to the same rules. Karathi delegate stood, his voice carrying across the chamber. And what happens if we break these rules? What happens if we return to the old ways? Chen looked at him directly. Then you'll discover something important. These past 7 months, what you experienced was humanity being merciful. We destroyed military targets. We blockaded economies. We exposed your crimes. But we showed restraint. Her expression hardened. If you test us again, if you return to genocide and oppression, and the casual cruelty that defined the Council, you'll learn what happens when we stop showing restraint. And I promise you, you don't want to learn that lesson. Admiral James Chen stood next to his sister. He wore his uniform with its medals earned in 7 months of conflict. His presence was a reminder of what humanity had accomplished. We don't make the same mistake twice, he said quietly. For 30 years, we believed that patience and diplomacy would be enough. We were wrong. We learned. We adapted. We won. If you force us to learn another lesson, we'll be just as thorough. The message was clear. Humanity had proven they could win wars. Now, they were offering peace. but it was peace backed by the certainty of what would happen if that peace was broken. Over the following weeks, the new system took shape. The war crimes tribunals began. Vryn officials found themselves answering questions from Talvari judges about the extinction of 3 minor species. Karathi military officers faced Palaxian prosecutors regarding forced labor camps. Zephyri administrators were questioned about genetic experimentation on unwilling subjects. The humans observed but didn't interfere. They had provided the evidence, the documentation, the proof. But the justice itself belonged to the victims. Reparations began flowing. Territories were returned. The Kepler cluster, which had sparked the Karathi's fatal attack, was granted independence under its human colonists, who immediately opened trade negotiations with neighboring systems regardless of species. The galactic economy, which had collapsed during the war, began to rebuild. Human engineers returned to fix the hyperspace relay network, but this time they trained local workers from dozens of species. Human doctors returned to treat plague victims, but they brought teachers with them to share medical knowledge. Human traders returned to their roots, but they negotiated fair contracts instead of accepting whatever they were offered. Thelzan attended a session. Economic policy was being debated. He watched a minor species delegate argue with a human representative about trade regulations. They disagreed strongly, but they were disagreeing as equals, and when the vote came, the minor species won. That's when Thelzan finally understood what humanity had done. They hadn't just won a war. They had reset the entire power structure of galactic civilization. And they had done it in a way that made sure no one species, including humanity, could dominate the others. A year after the war began, Ambassador Yellen of the Talvari Unity stood before the assembly to deliver a speech marking the anniversary of the new government. "We lost many things in the past year," she said. "The old certainties, the old hierarchies, the comfortable lies we told ourselves about the way things had to be. But we gained something more valuable, the chance to be better." She looked toward the human delegation. "Humanity taught us a lesson we'll never forget. Not because they were stronger than us, though they were. Not because they were smarter than us, though in many ways they were. But because they showed us that strength without justice is just tyranny, and patience without dignity is just cowardice. They proved that a species could be powerful and honorable, that you could win wars without becoming monsters, that you could demand justice without seeking revenge." Her voice grew softer. "They also proved that we were wrong. We thought we understood humans. We thought they were weak because they compromised. We thought they were inferior because they accepted our rules. We learned, in the most painful way possible, that we had mistaken patience for weakness and restraint for inability." Chenwei listened to the speech with mixed feelings. Yes, humanity had won. Yes, they had changed the galaxy. But the cost had been measured in lives, the 300,000 dead on New Harvest. The soldiers who died in battles across dozens of systems. The human medical teams killed before the war even started. After the session, Thelzan approached Chenwei in the halls outside the chamber. "Ambassador," he said quietly, "may I ask you a question?" "Of course. During all those years at the council, when we insulted you, when we made unfair demands, when we treated you as inferiors, were you always planning for this? Were you always preparing for war?" Chenwei was silent for a long moment. "We were always hoping for peace. Every single day, we hoped you would see us as equals without us having to prove it. But yes, we were preparing for the possibility that hope wouldn't be enough. Humans have a saying, hope for the best, prepare for the worst." "And if we had treated you fairly," Thelzan asked, "if the council had welcomed you as equals from the beginning?" Chenwei smiled sadly. "Then we would have been happy to sit in those chambers forever, making compromises and finding consensus. We didn't want war, Ambassador. We wanted peace. You taught us that sometimes you can't have one without being ready for the other." She started to walk away, then turned back. "There's another human saying you should know. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. The council made peaceful change impossible, so we made violent change inevitable. I hope the galaxy remembers that lesson, as well as they remember our military victories. Thelzan watched her go, understanding finally settling over him like a weight. Humanity hadn't just defeated the Galactic Council. They had shown everyone what leadership actually looked like. Not the strong dominating the weak, but the strong protecting the weak and holding everyone, including themselves, accountable to the same standards. As delegates filed out of the assembly chambers, heading to debates and negotiations in the slow, difficult work of building a better civilization, Thelzin thought about the future. It wouldn't be perfect. There would be conflicts and setbacks in species that tested the new rules. But now everyone knew. What would happen if they pushed too far? Humanity had proven they could fight. They had proven they could win. And most importantly, they had proven they knew when to stop. That last part, Thelzan thought, might be the most dangerous thing about them. An enemy you could defeat or an enemy you could negotiate with was manageable. But an enemy who knew exactly how much force to use, who understood the difference between power and cruelty, who could show both mercy and strength. That was something the galaxy had never seen before. And now that they had, Thelzan suspected nothing would ever be the same again.